Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Complete Story of Lazarus, the man who returned from the dead. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For nearly 2,000 years, one question has echoed through the pages of history. What really happened in the small village of Bethany when a man who had been dead for 4 days walked out of his own tomb? This was not just another miracle. According to the Gospel of John, it was the moment that changed everything. It shocked witnesses, divided crowds, terrified religious leaders, and set in motion the final chain of events that would lead Jesus to the cross. But beyond the famous command, "Lazarus, come out," lies a much deeper story. A story of friendship, grief, faith, political tension, and a delay that seemed impossible to understand. Why did Jesus wait when his friend was dying? Why did he weep if he already knew what he was about to do? And why did the raising of Lazarus become one of the most controversial events in the entire New Testament? To answer those questions, we must return to Bethany and uncover the complete story of Lazarus. Long before Lazarus became known as the man who walked out of his own tomb, his story began in a small village called Bethany, nestled on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Bethany lay less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, close enough to feel the influence of the holy city, yet far enough away to maintain a quieter rhythm of life. To modern readers, that distance may seem insignificant, but in the first century, it placed Bethany in a uniquely important position. Jerusalem was the religious heart of Judaism, home to the temple, the priesthood, and the powerful groups that shaped Jewish society under Roman rule. Every major religious festival drew enormous crowds into the city, filling its streets with pilgrims, merchants, teachers, and political tensions. Bethany existed in the shadow of this great center of power, making it an ideal place for travelers to rest and for Jesus to stay during his visits to Jerusalem. Archaeological studies and historical reconstructions of the region suggest that villages like Bethany were small agricultural communities whose residents lived simple lives compared to the wealthier elites associated with the temple establishment. Yet, throughout history, some of the most significant events have emerged from the most unexpected places. The Gospels introduce Bethany as the home of 3 siblings, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, while Lazarus himself speaks no recorded words in the New Testament. The family surrounding him occupies a remarkably important place within the Gospel narratives. Martha is portrayed as diligent and practical, often focused on serving guests and managing the responsibilities of the household. Mary appears as a deeply reflective disciple who valued sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to his teaching. Together, they formed a household that seems to have welcomed Jesus on multiple occasions, providing him with friendship and hospitality during a period when opposition against him was steadily increasing. This detail may seem small at first, but it reveals something important about the historical Jesus. Much of his ministry involved large crowds, public teaching, and confrontations with religious authorities, yet the Gospels also reveal a more personal side of his life. He was not merely a teacher passing through villages. He formed genuine relationships with real people. Bethany appears to have been one of the places where Jesus could step away from the pressure of public ministry and spend time among trusted friends. The location of the village made this relationship even more significant. By the time the events of John chapter 11 begin, tensions between Jesus and many religious leaders in Jerusalem had already reached dangerous levels. His teachings, miracles, and growing popularity had created increasing controversy. Some viewed him as a prophet. Others wondered whether he could be the long-awaited Messiah. Still others saw him as a threat to religious stability and political order. Under Roman occupation, any movement capable of stirring large crowds attracted attention, and Jewish leaders often feared that unrest could provoke a harsh response from Rome. Against this backdrop, Bethany became more than a peaceful village. It stood near the fault line of a growing conflict that would eventually lead to the crucifixion. What makes this setting particularly fascinating is that the story of Lazarus is not isolated from the larger narrative of Jesus' final days. In fact, it serves as one of the most important turning points in the entire Gospel of John. Before the raising of Lazarus, opposition against Jesus was already building. After the raising of Lazarus, that opposition would intensify dramatically. The miracle that occurred in Bethany would become one of the final catalysts, leading powerful leaders to conclude that Jesus had to die. Understanding this connection is essential, because it transforms the story from a simple account of a miraculous healing into a pivotal moment within the broader history of early Christianity. Yet, before the tragedy, before the illness, before the tears, and before the empty tomb in Bethany shocked everyone who witnessed it, there was simply a family living in a small village near Jerusalem. They could not have known that their names would be remembered for centuries. They could not have known that their home would become the setting for one of the most discussed miracles in history. And they certainly could not have known that the events about to unfold would help set the stage for the final journey of Jesus toward the cross. The complete story of Lazarus begins not with death, but with a village, a family, and a relationship that would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. If Bethany provided the setting for the story, the family living there provided its heart. Before Lazarus became known throughout history as the man who returned from the dead, he was simply part of a household that held a unique place in the life of Jesus. The Gospel of John introduces this family in a way that immediately separates them from nearly everyone else mentioned in the narrative. When the crisis begins, the text does not first describe Lazarus' illness or the danger he faces. Instead, it emphasizes a relationship. John tells his readers that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. This statement may appear simple, but within the context of the Gospel, it carries enormous significance. Throughout his ministry, Jesus taught crowds, healed strangers, confronted religious leaders, and traveled constantly from place to place, yet only a small number of individuals are presented as people with whom he shared a deeply personal friendship. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary belong to that rare circle. To understand why the events that follow become so emotionally powerful, we must first understand the bond that already existed between them. The New Testament offers several glimpses into this household before Lazarus falls ill. Martha is often remembered as practical, organized, and devoted to caring for guests. In the culture of first-century Judea, hospitality was far more than simple politeness. Opening one's home to travelers was considered a serious responsibility and an expression of honor. Martha's dedication to serving others reflected virtues that were highly respected in Jewish society. Mary, on the other hand, appears in a different role. She is remembered for sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to his teaching. To modern readers, this image may seem ordinary, but in the ancient world, sitting at the feet of a teacher was the posture of a disciple. It suggested commitment, learning, and spiritual devotion. Together, the two sisters reveal different but complementary expressions of faith. One served faithfully through action. The other sought understanding through attentive listening. Yet, at the center of the family stood Lazarus, perhaps the most mysterious figure in the entire account. Unlike Martha and Mary, Lazarus never speaks a single recorded word in the gospel narrative. No sermons are attributed to him. No conversations are preserved. No public declarations are remembered. In fact, before his illness, almost nothing is said about him at all. From a historical perspective, this silence is fascinating. It suggests that the Gospel writers were not interested in Lazarus because of his achievements, influence, or status. He was not a priest, a political leader, or a famous teacher. He appears to have been an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Yet, history would remember him because his life became intertwined with one of the most extraordinary moments in the ministry of Jesus. Perhaps the clearest evidence of the relationship between Jesus and this family appears in the message sent when Lazarus becomes sick. The sisters do not attempt to persuade Jesus through elaborate arguments. They do not remind him of favors performed or sacrifices made. Instead, they send a remarkably simple message. Lord, the one you love is sick. The statement reveals extraordinary confidence. Martha and Mary believe that the relationship itself is enough. They assume Jesus will immediately understand who they are talking about. They do not need to explain. They do not need to justify their request. They simply trust that his love for Lazarus will move him to act. This detail is important because it reveals the expectations that existed before the tragedy unfolded. The sisters knew Jesus could heal the sick. By this stage of his ministry, numerous miracles had already taken place. The blind had received sight. The lame had walked. Diseases that terrified entire communities had been cured. If Jesus could do all of that for strangers, surely he would come for a beloved friend. From their perspective, the outcome may have seemed almost certain. He would receive the message, travel to Bethany, heal Lazarus, and everything would return to normal. Yet, the story is carefully constructed to challenge exactly that assumption. Before the crisis arrives, John wants readers to understand beyond any doubt that Jesus genuinely cared about this family. This point is essential because later events might otherwise create confusion. When Jesus delays his journey, some might wonder whether he did not care. When Lazarus dies, some might question whether he had abandoned them. When Martha and Mary express grief and disappointment, readers might ask why such suffering was allowed to happen in the first place. John removes those possibilities before the story even begins. The problem is not a lack of love. The relationship is real. The affection is genuine. The friendship is unquestionable. The coming events will therefore force everyone involved to wrestle with a far more difficult mystery. What happens when the person you trust most does not respond the way you expect? This question lies at the heart of the Lazarus story and explains why it continues to resonate with readers nearly 2,000 years later. Most people can understand unanswered questions. Most people can relate to moments when hope seems delayed. Martha, Mary, and Lazarus were not distant spectators watching miracles happen to others. They were people who believed they were deeply loved by Jesus. That conviction made what happened next even harder to understand. As life continued in Bethany, neither the family nor the disciples could have imagined how quickly everything was about to change. The quiet household that had become a place of friendship and welcome would soon become the center of a crisis that would test faith, challenge expectations, and ultimately alter the course of events leading to the cross. And it all began with a sickness that seemed, at first, no different from countless others. For a time, life in Bethany appeared unchanged. The household that had welcomed Jesus so many times continued its ordinary routines, and nothing suggested that history was about to turn in a completely unexpected direction. Then, Lazarus became sick. The Gospel of John provides very few details about the nature of his illness. We are not told whether it began suddenly or developed gradually. We do not know his symptoms, his age, or how long he suffered before the situation became critical. Such silence is typical of ancient narratives, which often focus less on medical specifics and more on the meaning of events. Yet, even without those details, one fact is clear. The illness was serious enough to alarm Martha and Mary. In the ancient world, sickness carried a level of danger that is often difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate. Without antibiotics, advanced surgery, or modern diagnostic tools, conditions that seem manageable today could quickly become fatal. Families frequently watched loved ones decline with little ability to intervene. For Martha and Mary, the growing weakness of their brother must have created an atmosphere of fear that intensified with each passing day. As Lazarus's condition worsened, the sisters made a decision that seemed entirely reasonable. They sent a message to Jesus. This choice reveals both their desperation and their confidence. They had witnessed his power. They knew his reputation. They believed he could help. More importantly, they believed he would help. The message they sent was remarkably simple. "Lord, the one you love is sick." There was no lengthy explanation, no dramatic appeal, and no attempt to persuade him. The statement itself carried an unspoken expectation. Come quickly, help him, save him. From their perspective, there was every reason to believe that Jesus would respond immediately. Throughout his ministry, he had shown compassion to strangers. He had crossed social barriers to heal outsiders. He had responded to the cries of people he had never met before. If he cared enough to do that, how much more would he come for someone he loved? The sisters likely assumed the situation was straightforward. The messenger would reach Jesus. Jesus would hear the news. He would travel to Bethany. Lazarus would recover. The crisis would pass. Yet, the narrative immediately begins moving in a direction no one expected. When Jesus receives the message, his first recorded response is striking. He declares that the sickness will not end in death but is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. This statement has fascinated scholars and theologians for centuries, because it reveals that Jesus views the situation through a completely different lens than everyone else involved. Martha and Mary see a medical emergency. The disciples see a troubling report about a friend. Jesus sees an event that will reveal something profound about God's purposes. The tension of the story begins at this very moment, because the audience is allowed to hear Jesus' perspective, while the family in Bethany remains unaware of it. They do not know what he has said. They do not know what he understands. They only know that their brother is dying. As hours pass, hope likely begins to collide with uncertainty. Every sound at the door might have raised expectations that Jesus had arrived. Every delay may have increased anxiety. Meanwhile, the messenger who delivered the news had probably completed his task and returned. The sisters may have expected him to return alongside Jesus. Instead, they waited. The Gospel account creates a powerful contrast between what is happening in Bethany and what is happening where Jesus is staying. In Bethany, the crisis is becoming more urgent with every passing moment. In the other location, Jesus remains where he is. This contrast forms the emotional core of the chapter. Many readers instinctively focus on the miracle at the end of the story, but the deeper struggle begins here. It begins in the waiting. It begins in the uncertainty. It begins in the silence between the request and the response. Historically speaking, travel in first-century Judea was not instantaneous, even under the best conditions. Messengers required time to reach their destination, and travelers required time to return. Yet the issue in the story is not merely distance, it is expectation. Martha and Mary believed they knew what Jesus would do, because his past actions seemed to provide a clear pattern. Again and again, he had responded to suffering with immediate compassion. Again and again, he had intervened when people cried out for help, Everything they knew about him suggested that he would come quickly. The fact that he did not immediately appear would soon create questions far more painful than the illness itself. Had something prevented him from coming? Had the message failed to reach him? Had he chosen not to come? Such questions often emerge when people face circumstances they cannot understand. The Lazarus story resonates across centuries precisely because it touches a universal human experience. Many people find it easy to trust when answers arrive quickly. Faith becomes more difficult when silence follows the request. Yet John carefully prepares readers to understand that the silence in this story is not the result of indifference. Jesus has already been described as loving the family. That fact remains unchanged. The love is real. The relationship is real. The concern is real. Nevertheless, events continue moving toward a conclusion no one in Bethany wants to face. As the illness advances, the sisters can do little more than wait. Their trust in Jesus remains, but their confidence is about to be tested in ways they never imagined. The message has been sent. The request has been made. The hope of intervention remains alive. Yet somewhere between expectation and reality, the story begins to enter its darkest phase. Soon, the family that believed help was on the way will be forced to confront a possibility they never expected. Jesus has received the message. He knows exactly what is happening, and still, he has not come. At this point in the story, the greatest mystery is no longer Lazarus's illness. The greatest mystery is Jesus' response. The messenger had successfully delivered the news. The request for help had reached its intended destination. Jesus knew that his friend was seriously ill. He knew that Martha and Mary were waiting. He knew that time was running out. Yet instead of beginning the journey to Bethany immediately, he remained where he was. The Gospel of John records a detail that has puzzled readers for nearly 2,000 years. After hearing that Lazarus was sick, Jesus stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. The statement is astonishing because it appears to contradict everything the audience expects. If Jesus loves this family, why wait? If he intends to help, why delay? If he possesses the power to heal, why allow the situation to become worse? These questions form the emotional and theological center of the Lazarus narrative. In many ways, the raising of Lazarus is not ultimately a story about death. It is a story about timing. More specifically, it is a story about the tension between human expectations and divine purposes. From the perspective of Martha and Mary, every hour mattered. Their brother's condition was deteriorating. The window for intervention seemed to be closing. They had sent for Jesus precisely because they believed immediate action was necessary. Yet, from Jesus' perspective, events were unfolding according to a larger purpose that they could not yet see. This contrast between limited human understanding and a broader divine plan appears throughout Scripture, but few stories illustrate it as dramatically as this one. The delay creates a crisis not only for the family, but also for anyone attempting to understand the character of Jesus. If he had never received the message, the situation would be easier to explain. If he lacked the power to help, the outcome would make sense. But neither explanation is possible. The Gospel deliberately removes those options. Jesus knows. Jesus cares. Jesus has the power to act. And still he waits. This is precisely why the story continues to resonate with readers across centuries. Many people have experienced moments when their expectations collided with silence. They prayed for healing and watched a condition worsen. They hoped for a solution and encountered further obstacles. They expected immediate intervention and instead faced uncertainty. The Lazarus narrative speaks directly into that experience because it refuses to avoid the uncomfortable questions. It acknowledges the reality of waiting when answers seem absent. Yet the Gospel also provides clues that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. When Jesus first hears about the illness, he declares that it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. This statement does not mean that suffering itself is good, nor does it suggest that God takes pleasure in human pain. Rather, it reveals that the coming events will accomplish something far greater than a simple healing. Up to this point in his ministry, Jesus had performed numerous miracles. The blind had received sight. The lame had walked. Diseases had been cured. But what was about to happen in Bethany would surpass all previous signs in both scale and significance. The delay itself becomes part of the unfolding purpose. Had Jesus arrived immediately and healed Lazarus, the event would certainly have been remarkable. Yet it would have resembled many miracles that had already occurred. By waiting, the circumstances changed completely. The situation moved beyond sickness into death. The crisis deepened. Human hope diminished. The possibility of a natural explanation disappeared. What looked like a tragedy in progress was actually creating the conditions for a revelation, unlike anything the crowds had yet witnessed. While Jesus remained where he was, Lazarus's condition continued to decline. The Gospel does not describe those final hours, but it is not difficult to imagine the atmosphere in Bethany. Martha and Mary had likely exhausted every available option. Relatives and neighbors may have come to offer support. Conversations that once centered on recovery gradually shifted toward fear. The longer Jesus failed to appear, the harder it became to understand what was happening. Each passing hour may have felt like evidence that help was slipping away. Yet the tragedy of the moment lies in the fact that they did not possess the information available to the reader. They could not hear Jesus' earlier declaration. They could not see the larger picture. They could only interpret events through what appeared to be happening in front of them. This limitation is important because it reflects a recurring pattern in human experience. People often evaluate circumstances based on immediate evidence, while remaining unaware of factors beyond their perspective. The Lazarus story invites readers to consider the possibility that apparent silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is simply a stage in a larger process that has not yet reached its conclusion. Eventually, after the 2-day delay, Jesus turns to his disciples and announces that they will return to Judea. Even this decision creates confusion. The disciples immediately remember the danger waiting there. Religious leaders had already attempted to stone him. Returning so soon seems reckless, yet Jesus speaks with calm certainty, as though he is following a timetable known only to him. Then he makes a statement that initially confuses the disciples. "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The disciples misunderstand the metaphor and assume Lazarus is recovering. Jesus then speaks plainly. Lazarus is dead. What follows may be one of the most surprising statements in the entire chapter. Jesus tells them that for their sake he is glad he was not there, so that they may believe. At first glance, the statement sounds shocking. How could anyone be glad in the face of a friend's death? Yet Jesus is not expressing joy over suffering. He is pointing toward what the disciples are about to witness. The coming miracle will strengthen their understanding of who he truly is. The delay that looked like failure will become evidence of divine authority. The silence that seemed confusing will reveal a purpose larger than anyone imagined. But none of that is visible yet to the grieving family in Bethany. From their perspective, the worst has already happened. Their brother is gone. The healer they trusted did not arrive. The hope they held on to has collapsed, and somewhere on the road to Judea, Jesus is finally coming, not to prevent a death, but to confront it. While Jesus remained where he was, the crisis in Bethany reached its irreversible conclusion. Lazarus died. The Gospel of John records this fact with remarkable simplicity. Yet behind those few words lies an immense human tragedy for Martha and Mary. This was not merely the loss of a brother. In the ancient world, family relationships carried economic, social, and emotional significance far beyond what many modern societies experience today. A household depended heavily upon the cooperation and support of its members. The death of a brother could affect security, stability, inheritance, and the future of an entire family. More importantly, it brought the crushing grief that accompanies the loss of someone deeply loved. Whatever hopes the sisters had held on to during Lazarus' illness now disappeared. The miracle they expected never came. The healer they trusted did not arrive. The brother they believed could still be saved was gone. To understand the full weight of the moment, it is important to understand how death and burial were handled in first-century Judea. Unlike modern practices that often involve days or even weeks between death and burial, Jewish custom typically required burial to occur as quickly as possible, often on the same day. The warm climate of the region made lengthy delays impractical, and religious traditions emphasized the prompt care of the deceased. Family members and neighbors would prepare the body by washing it and wrapping it in linen cloths. Fragrant spices and aromatic substances were frequently used, both as expressions of honor and to help reduce the odor associated with decomposition. The body would then be placed inside a tomb, often a natural cave or a rock-cut chamber carved into the hillside. Archaeological discoveries throughout Judea have uncovered many such tombs dating to the period of Jesus, providing valuable insight into the burial customs described in the Gospels. These tombs frequently served as family burial places, containing multiple chambers where relatives could be laid to rest over generations. After Lazarus died, his body was prepared according to these customs and placed inside such a tomb. A large stone was positioned at the entrance, sealing the chamber. For everyone present, the story appeared finished. Death had spoken the final word. Yet John includes a detail that becomes one of the most important elements in the entire narrative. By the time Jesus arrives near Bethany, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. At first glance, this may seem like a simple chronological note, but historians, biblical scholars, and theologians have long recognized its significance. The number is not incidental. John wants his readers to understand that Lazarus was unquestionably dead. In the ancient world, rumors and misunderstandings sometimes surrounded reports of death. Stories occasionally circulated about people who appeared dead but later recovered. Whether such accounts were accurate or exaggerated is not the point. The point is that John deliberately removes every possibility of confusion. 4 days had passed. The burial had already taken place. Mourners had gathered. The tomb had remained sealed. No reasonable observer could argue that Lazarus was merely unconscious or recovering from illness. Whatever happened next could not be explained as a delayed medical recovery. The significance of the 4th day may also carry additional cultural meaning. Some later Jewish traditions, though not universally held, suggested that the soul lingered near the body for a short period after death before departing completely. While scholars debate how widespread such beliefs were during the 1st century, many note that John's mention of 4 days effectively pushes the situation beyond any conceivable hope, whether viewed medically, culturally, or emotionally. Lazarus was gone. The finality of death had settled over Bethany. Meanwhile, life in the village became dominated by mourning. Jewish grieving practices during this period were communal rather than private. Family members did not suffer in isolation. Friends, neighbors, and relatives gathered to offer comfort and share in the sorrow. Expressions of grief were often public and intense. Professional mourners were sometimes employed to lament alongside the family, creating an atmosphere where sorrow was openly acknowledged rather than hidden. Modern readers occasionally find these customs unfamiliar, but they reflected a culture that understood grief as a collective experience. When one family suffered loss, the community suffered with them. As a result, Martha and Mary were surrounded by people who had come to support them, yet even the presence of others could not erase the painful question lingering beneath everything. Where was Jesus? Days earlier they had sent for him. Days earlier they had believed he would come. Now Lazarus lay inside a sealed tomb. Every hour that passed seemed to reinforce the conclusion that he had arrived too late. The tragedy was made even sharper by what everyone knew about Jesus' abilities. Had he healed strangers from a distance before? Yes. Had he cured illnesses that appeared hopeless? Certainly. Had he demonstrated power beyond ordinary human explanation? Repeatedly. This is precisely why his absence would have been so difficult to understand. If anyone could have changed the outcome, it was him. Yet he had not come. From the perspective of Martha and Mary, the story no longer appeared to be about healing. It had become a story about loss. The contrast between what they expected and what actually happened could not have been greater. Yet, unknown to everyone gathered in Bethany, the narrative was moving toward a moment unlike anything they could imagine. The very fact that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days would soon become essential to understanding the miracle that was about to occur. The deeper the certainty of death, the greater the impact of what would follow. The more impossible the situation appeared, the more undeniable the coming sign would become. For now, however, none of that was visible. There was only grief, silence, and a sealed tomb standing as a monument to shattered expectations. Martha mourned, Mary mourned, friends mourned, the village mourned, and inside the darkness of a rock-cut grave, Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days, as grief settled over Bethany. Jesus finally made his decision. The waiting was over. The delay that had confused the disciples and devastated Lazarus' family had reached its conclusion. Jesus turned to those traveling with him and announced that they would return to Judea. At first, this statement may not seem particularly dramatic. After all, Bethany was located in Judea, and visiting grieving friends would appear to be a natural response. Yet, the disciples immediately understood something that modern readers can easily miss. This was not simply a journey to comfort a mourning family. It was a journey back into danger. In fact, their reaction reveals just how serious the situation had become. They responded by reminding Jesus that not long before, people in Judea had tried to stone him. Why return now? Why walk willingly back into a region where powerful enemies were already searching for an opportunity to eliminate him? To understand the tension surrounding this moment, we must step back and examine the broader context of Jesus' ministry. By the time the events of John chapter 11 take place, opposition against Jesus had been building for a considerable period. His teachings had attracted enormous crowds. His miracles had generated intense public interest. His claims regarding his relationship with God had sparked controversy among religious leaders. While many ordinary people admired him, others viewed him as increasingly dangerous. The central issue was not merely theological disagreement. The situation involved religious authority, social influence, and political stability. Jerusalem was not only the spiritual center of Judaism. Under Roman occupation, it was also a place where unrest could quickly become a political problem. The Jewish leadership understood that Rome watched the region carefully. Any figure capable of attracting large crowds and inspiring messianic expectations risked drawing unwanted attention from imperial authorities. As Jesus' popularity grew, so did concerns among those responsible for maintaining order. The Gospel of John records several confrontations that illustrate this growing hostility. Debates over the Sabbath, disputes concerning his authority, and statements that many interpreted as blasphemous had created an atmosphere of escalating conflict. In one particularly dramatic encounter, opponents picked up stones intending to kill him. Jesus escaped, but the message was unmistakable. Certain influential individuals no longer viewed him merely as a controversial teacher. They viewed him as a threat. This background explains why the disciples reacted with alarm when he announced his intention to return to Judea. From their perspective, the decision seemed reckless. Lazarus was already dead. Nothing could change that. Why risk everyone's safety now? Yet Jesus responded with a calmness that stood in sharp contrast to their fears. He spoke about walking in the daylight and fulfilling the work appointed by God. The imagery may sound poetic, but the meaning is profound. Jesus understood his mission as operating according to a divine timetable. He was not ignoring danger. He was refusing to be controlled by it. Throughout the Gospels, a recurring theme emerges, again and again. Jesus, with a sense of purpose that transcends immediate circumstances. He does not allow public opinion, political pressures, or personal threats to dictate his actions. Instead, he consistently moves according to what he understands to be the will of his Father. The journey back to Judea provides one of the clearest examples of this principle. Human logic suggested staying away. Self-preservation suggested avoiding unnecessary risk. The disciples certainly preferred caution, yet Jesus chose the path that led directly toward confrontation. His willingness to return also reveals something important about his relationship with Lazarus and his family. Earlier chapters established that he loved them. Now that love is demonstrated through action, although he delayed his departure, he did not abandon them. The delay was purposeful, but it was not permanent. Eventually, he set out for Bethany despite the danger waiting there. This distinction matters because some readers mistakenly interpret the delay as indifference. The narrative consistently rejects that interpretation. Jesus knew exactly what had happened. He knew Lazarus was dead. He knew grief had overwhelmed the household. He knew the disciples feared for his safety. Nevertheless, he went. As the group traveled toward Judea, another remarkable moment occurred. Jesus told the disciples that Lazarus had fallen asleep and that he was going to awaken him. Once again, the disciples misunderstood. Assuming Jesus meant ordinary sleep, they concluded that Lazarus might be recovering. Jesus then spoke plainly. Lazarus is dead. The directness of the statement leaves no room for ambiguity. Yet, what follows is equally striking. Jesus tells them that he is glad he was not there, so that they may believe. This declaration points toward a purpose extending beyond the immediate tragedy. The disciples are about to witness something that will deepen their understanding of who Jesus truly is. The coming miracle is not merely for Lazarus. It is also for those who follow Jesus, those who doubt him, and those who will later hear the story through the pages of the Gospel. The journey toward Bethany therefore carries multiple layers of significance. On the surface, it is a trip to visit grieving friends. On a deeper level, it is a deliberate movement toward a revelation that will change everything. Yet perhaps the most fascinating response comes from Thomas, one of the disciples often remembered primarily for his later doubts. Hearing Jesus' decision to return to Judea, Thomas speaks with surprising courage. "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Scholars continue to debate the exact tone of his statement. Some interpret it as pessimistic resignation. Others see genuine loyalty. Whatever his motivation, the comment reveals how dangerous the disciples believed the situation to be. Thomas does not expect a triumphant outcome. He expects potential disaster. From his perspective, they may all be walking toward death. Ironically, he is more correct than he realizes. Although the immediate journey will not end with their deaths, the events unfolding in Bethany will indeed accelerate the chain of circumstances leading Jesus toward the cross. This is one reason the raising of Lazarus occupies such a pivotal place in John's Gospel. It is not an isolated miracle inserted into the narrative. It serves as a bridge between Jesus' public ministry and his final confrontation with the authorities. Every step taken toward Bethany is also a step toward Jerusalem. Every mile traveled toward Lazarus is a mile traveled toward the crucifixion. The disciples cannot yet see that connection. Martha and Mary certainly cannot see it. Even the crowds gathering around Lazarus' tomb remain unaware. Yet history is already moving toward its decisive moment. As Jesus and his followers continue along the road, Bethany waits ahead. A grieving family waits ahead. A sealed tomb waits ahead. And beyond all of them stands a conflict that is rapidly approaching its unavoidable conclusion. The journey back to Judea is not simply a return to a village. It is the beginning of the final stage of the story. As Jesus approached Bethany, the story entered one of its most emotionally charged and theologically significant moments. News of his arrival reached the village before he entered it, and Martha immediately went out to meet him. This detail is entirely consistent with what readers already know about her character. Throughout the Gospel accounts, Martha is portrayed as a woman of action. While others remained inside the house surrounded by mourners, she took the initiative. Yet when she finally stood before Jesus, the words that came from her mouth revealed a mixture of faith, grief, disappointment, and hope that makes this encounter one of the most remarkable conversations in the entire New Testament. Martha said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." At first glance, the statement sounds like a gentle rebuke, and perhaps it contains an element of that. After all, she had sent for Jesus days earlier. She knew he had the power to heal. She believed Lazarus would still be alive if Jesus had arrived sooner. Yet her words are not an accusation. They are the expression of a wounded faith struggling to understand a painful reality. What makes the statement extraordinary is what follows. Martha continues by saying, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." In a single sentence, she reveals the tension at the heart of the story. She believes and she grieves. She trusts and she struggles. She is disappointed and yet still hopeful. The combination feels deeply authentic because it reflects the complexity of real faith. Genuine belief does not eliminate questions. It does not erase sorrow. It often exists alongside both. Jesus responds by telling her that her brother will rise again. Martha immediately interprets the statement within the framework of traditional Jewish belief. By the first century, many Jews, particularly the Pharisees, believed in a future resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. Martha therefore answers that she knows Lazarus will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Her response demonstrates theological understanding. She accepts the promise of future resurrection, yet from her perspective, that future remains distant. It offers comfort, but it does not solve the pain of the present moment. Lazarus is still dead. The tomb is still sealed. The house is still filled with mourners. It is here that Jesus makes one of the most profound declarations recorded anywhere in the Gospels. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." These words stand at the very center of the Lazarus narrative. In fact, many scholars consider them one of the most important Christological statements in the Gospel of John. Notice what Jesus does not say. He does not merely claim to possess knowledge about resurrection. He does not simply promise that resurrection will happen someday. Instead, he identifies himself as its source. Resurrection is not presented merely as an event. It is inseparably connected to his person. Life itself is not merely something he gives. It is something he embodies. This distinction is crucial because it transforms the entire conversation. Martha is thinking about a future doctrine. Jesus is pointing to a present reality standing directly in front of her. Historically, this declaration would have sounded astonishing. Jewish teachers discussed resurrection as something God would accomplish at the end of history. Jesus speaks as though the power of that future age is already present in him. The statement, therefore, goes far beyond comforting a grieving sister. It is a revelation about his identity. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus repeatedly uses the phrase, "I am," in ways that carry profound theological significance. He declares himself the bread of life, the light of the world, the good shepherd, and the true vine. Here he declares himself the resurrection and the life. Each statement reveals another aspect of who he claims to be. Together, they form a portrait that goes far beyond the role of prophet, teacher, or miracle worker. The conversation then reaches its climax when Jesus asks Martha a direct question. "Do you believe this?" Notice how personal the question is. He does not ask whether she understands every theological detail. He does not ask whether she can explain the mystery of suffering. He asks whether she believes. Martha's response ranks among the greatest confessions of faith in the New Testament. She answers, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." The significance of this declaration cannot be overstated. At a moment when circumstances seem to contradict everything she hoped for, Martha affirms her trust in Jesus' identity. Lazarus remains dead. No miracle has yet occurred. Nothing has changed externally. Yet she still confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. This makes her statement all the more powerful. It is faith expressed before the resolution arrives. It is trust maintained in the middle of uncertainty. From a narrative perspective, Martha's confession serves an important function. The story is moving toward one of the most dramatic miracles in the Bible. But John wants readers to understand that the central issue is not merely whether Lazarus will come out of the tomb. The deeper issue is whether people recognize who Jesus truly is. The miracle matters because it reveals something about him. Without that connection, the event becomes little more than an astonishing display of power. With that connection, it becomes a sign pointing toward his identity and mission. Martha may not yet understand exactly what Jesus is about to do. She certainly does not appear to expect the immediate resurrection of her brother. Nevertheless, she has reached a critical point in her journey. Her faith has been tested by silence, disappointment, and loss. Yet it has not collapsed. Instead, it has become more focused on the person standing before her. The conversation ends, but its implications continue to echo throughout the remainder of the chapter. Jesus has declared himself to be the resurrection and the life. Martha has confessed him as the Messiah and Son of God. The theological center of the story has now been established. All that remains is for the coming events to demonstrate what those extraordinary claims truly mean. And only a short distance away, behind the stone that seals a dark tomb, Lazarus still lies dead. After Martha returned to the village, she quietly informed her sister that Jesus had arrived and was asking for her. Unlike Martha's immediate and proactive response, Mary's reaction unfolded within the atmosphere of mourning that had consumed the household for days. The house was still filled with relatives, neighbors, and friends who had come from Jerusalem and the surrounding region to comfort the grieving sisters, when Mary suddenly rose and left. Many of the mourners assumed she was going to Lazarus's tomb to continue weeping there. Without realizing it, they followed her. What began as a private meeting between Jesus and a grieving sister quickly became a public moment witnessed by a crowd. This detail would prove significant because the events about to unfold would not occur in secret. Numerous people would see them with their own eyes. When Mary finally reached Jesus, she fell at his feet and spoke the exact same words Martha had spoken earlier. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The repetition is striking. It suggests that both sisters had likely expressed the same thought repeatedly during the days following Lazarus's death. Again and again they may have asked themselves the same painful question. Why had Jesus not arrived sooner? Unlike Martha, however, Mary adds nothing further. There is no discussion about resurrection. There is no theological conversation. There is only grief. She falls before Jesus and weeps. The simplicity of the scene gives it extraordinary emotional power. Sometimes sorrow reaches a point where explanations are no longer enough. Arguments no longer matter. Even faith itself struggles to find words. Mary embodies that reality. She does not debate. She mourns. What happens next is one of the most profound moments in the entire Gospel of John. As Jesus sees Mary weeping and observes the mourners weeping with her, the text says that he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The language John uses here has generated extensive discussion among biblical scholars because the original Greek expressions carry emotional intensity that is difficult to capture fully in translation. Some scholars argue that the words imply sorrow. Others suggest indignation, agitation, or even a form of righteous anger. The exact nuance remains debated, but most agree on one point. Jesus is experiencing a powerful emotional response. This is not detached observation. This is not calm distance. Something about the scene affects him deeply. The question is, why? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Jesus loves Lazarus and feels grief over his death. Certainly, that is part of the explanation. Yet many interpreters have noted an intriguing tension. Jesus already knows what he is about to do. He knows Lazarus will soon walk out of the tomb. He knows death is not about to have the final word. If that is the case, why is he so deeply troubled? Why does he weep? Throughout Christian history, several answers have been proposed. Some suggest that Jesus is grieving alongside the family because genuine compassion does not disappear simply because one knows the outcome. Others argue that he is confronting the terrible reality of death itself, the destructive force that has brought suffering into human experience since the beginning. Still others believe his emotional reaction reflects frustration at unbelief, sorrow over the brokenness of the world, or a combination of all these factors. Whatever explanation one adopts, the narrative makes one fact unmistakably clear. Jesus is not emotionally detached from human pain. This observation is enormously important because it reveals something essential about his character. In many ancient philosophies, divinity was often associated with emotional distance and impassibility. The gods were thought to exist beyond ordinary human suffering. The Jesus portrayed in John's Gospel is very different. He stands in the presence of grief and responds emotionally. He sees pain and feels it. He witnesses mourning and is moved by it. This moment, therefore, becomes one of the clearest demonstrations of his humanity. The same person who declared himself to be the resurrection and the life now stands among mourners with tears in his eyes. Then comes the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. Despite containing only 2 words in most English translations, the statement has inspired centuries of reflection. Its power lies partly in its brevity. John could have described Jesus' emotions in many ways, yet he chooses this simple declaration: Jesus wept. No elaborate explanation follows. No theological commentary interrupts the scene. The fact speaks for itself. The reaction of the crowd reveals how unusual and moving the moment was. Some observers looked at Jesus and said, "See how he loved him." They interpreted his tears as evidence of deep affection for Lazarus. Others responded differently. They wondered why the man who had opened the eyes of the blind had not prevented Lazarus from dying. Their question echoes the tension that has run through the entire narrative. If Jesus possessed such power, why did he wait? Why allow this tragedy to happen, even standing in the shadow of the coming miracle? Many people still viewed events through the lens of disappointment and confusion. In some ways, their perspective was understandable. They could not see what Jesus intended to do. They could only see a grieving family, a sealed tomb, and a man who appeared to have arrived too late. Yet John's narrative continues to direct attention toward a deeper reality. The tears of Jesus do not contradict his power. They reveal how he exercises it. He is not a distant miracle worker, performing demonstrations for an audience. He is a friend entering into the suffering of those he loves. His compassion is not weakened by his authority. If anything, it makes that authority more meaningful. The scene also serves as a powerful reminder that the Christian understanding of hope does not require the denial of grief. Jesus does not tell Mary to stop crying. He does not dismiss sorrow as unnecessary because a miracle is coming. Instead, he shares in the pain. This detail has resonated with generations of believers because it suggests that divine compassion is present even before circumstances change. Long before Lazarus emerges from the tomb, Jesus is already standing beside those who mourn. As the crowd watches, the emotional intensity of the moment continues to build. Jesus asks where Lazarus has been laid. The mourners invite him to come and see. Slowly, the group begins moving toward the tomb. Mary walks beside them. The crowd follows. The questions remain unanswered. The grief remains real. The tomb remains sealed. Yet something is changing. The tears have not ended the story. They have prepared the way for what comes next. And as Jesus approaches the place where Lazarus has lain for 4 days, the tension that has been building since the beginning of the narrative finally reaches its breaking point. The journey from the village to the tomb was short, but the tension surrounding it was immense. Jesus had now arrived at the place where every hope seemed buried. Before him stood a rock-cut tomb, the kind commonly used in first-century Judea. Archaeological discoveries throughout the region have revealed many similar burial chambers carved into limestone hillsides, often sealed with large stones placed across the entrance. For 4 days, that tomb had served as the final resting place of Lazarus. For 4 days, family members had mourned. For 4 days, friends had accepted the reality of his death. Every person standing there shared the same assumption. The story was over. Yet, Jesus approached the tomb as though it represented not an ending, but a beginning. The Gospel records that he was once again deeply moved as he stood before the entrance. The emotional intensity seen earlier had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. This is an important detail, because it reminds readers that what is about to happen does not emerge from cold detachment. Jesus is fully aware of the pain surrounding him. He sees Martha, he sees Mary, he sees the mourners, he sees the tomb, and then he gives a command that must have shocked everyone present. "Take away the stone." The instruction immediately creates tension because it appears both unnecessary and troubling. Why open the tomb? Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. There was no practical reason to disturb the grave. Martha, always practical and realistic, voiced the concern that many others were probably thinking. She reminded Jesus that Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days and that there would now be a strong odor. Her response is one of the most historically realistic details in the entire narrative. Martha is not expecting a resurrection. She is responding as any grieving sister would. She knows what happens to a body after death. She understands the finality of the situation. Her concern underscores a point John has been emphasizing throughout the story. Lazarus is not sleeping. He is not unconscious. He is not recovering. He is dead. Jesus responds by reminding Martha of something he had already said. If she believed, she would see the glory of God. The statement shifts attention away from the tomb and toward what God is about to reveal. Then, the stone is removed. One can only imagine the silence that followed. The crowd had accompanied Jesus to the grave expecting mourning. No one knew exactly what was about to happen. The disciples themselves had not been given specific details. Martha and Mary certainly did not anticipate what would occur next. The open tomb now stood before them, exposing the darkness within. Then, instead of immediately addressing Lazarus, Jesus lifted his eyes and prayed. This prayer is one of the most significant moments in the chapter because it reveals his purpose in performing the miracle publicly. He thanked the Father for hearing him and stated that he knew the Father always heard him. Yet he also explained that he was speaking for the benefit of the people standing around him, so that they might believe that the Father had sent him. This clarification is crucial. Throughout John's Gospel, miracles are never presented merely as demonstrations of power. They are signs. Their purpose is to reveal who Jesus is and to point people toward faith. The resurrection of Lazarus would become the greatest sign yet, not because it displayed power alone, but because it revealed the relationship between Jesus and the Father. The crowd standing around the tomb was about to witness something that would force them to make a decision about his identity. After the prayer, the moment that had been building throughout the entire narrative finally arrived. Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The simplicity of the command is striking. There are no elaborate rituals, no dramatic gestures, no lengthy incantations, no appeal to hidden forces. Jesus simply speaks. Yet, according to the Gospel account, his words carry authority over death itself. For centuries, Christian theologians have reflected on the significance of this moment. Some have observed that Jesus calls Lazarus by name, emphasizing the personal nature of the miracle. Others have noted that throughout Scripture, God's Word repeatedly functions as an instrument of creation and life. In Genesis, God speaks, and the world comes into existence. Here, Jesus speaks, and life returns where death had ruled. Whatever interpretation one adopts, the narrative presents the event as an unmistakable display of divine authority. Then, the impossible happened. Lazarus emerged from the tomb. John describes him as coming out with his hands and feet wrapped in burial cloths and a cloth around his face. The image is extraordinary. The man whose funeral had already taken place now stood alive before the very people who had mourned him. The crowd that moments earlier had been gathered around a grave now faced evidence that challenged every assumption about what was possible. The significance of the scene cannot be overstated. Throughout the ancient world, stories of healings were not entirely unknown. Reports of unusual recoveries occasionally circulated, but this was different. John has carefully constructed the narrative to eliminate alternative explanations. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. The burial had been completed. The tomb had been sealed. Witnesses had observed the entire process. The miracle, therefore, struck at the heart of humanity's greatest enemy, death itself. Yet, even now, Jesus gives another simple command: unbind him and let him go. The statement carries practical significance, because Lazarus was still wrapped in the cloths used for burial, but it also serves as a fitting conclusion to the miracle itself. The man who had been confined by death is released. The one who had been trapped inside a tomb is restored to life and community. For Martha and Mary, the moment must have been almost impossible to comprehend. Days earlier, they had watched their brother die. They had mourned him, buried him, and accepted the finality of his loss. Now he stood before them, alive. The grief that had defined Bethany for 4 days suddenly collided with overwhelming astonishment. Yet beyond the personal joy of the family, something even larger had occurred. Jesus had not merely performed another miracle. He had publicly demonstrated authority over death in front of numerous witnesses near Jerusalem itself. The implications would extend far beyond Bethany. Some who witnessed the event would believe in him. Others would react very differently. The miracle that restored Lazarus to life was about to trigger consequences that would change the course of Jesus' final days forever. The moment Lazarus stepped out of the tomb should have ended all debate. If the story followed ordinary human expectations, every witness would have responded the same way. They had seen a man who had been dead for 4 days emerge alive from a sealed grave. They had witnessed an event unlike anything they had ever experienced. One might assume that such overwhelming evidence would immediately convince everyone present. Yet the Gospel of John records something far more realistic and far more revealing about human nature. The miracle did not unite the crowd, it divided them. This reaction may initially seem surprising, but it reflects a recurring pattern throughout the Gospel. Again and again, Jesus performs signs that provoke opposite responses. Some people see the evidence and move toward faith. Others see the same evidence and become even more resistant. The raising of Lazarus, despite being the most dramatic sign in John's narrative, follows exactly the same pattern. The miracle reveals not only something about Jesus, it reveals something about the hearts of those who witness it. Many of the people who had come to comfort Martha and Mary responded with belief. This outcome is understandable. Unlike distant reports or second-hand stories, they had observed the event directly. They knew Lazarus had died. They knew he had been buried. They knew he had remained in the tomb for 4 days. Some of them had likely participated in the mourning process themselves. When they saw him alive again, they concluded that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. For these witnesses, the sign accomplished its intended purpose. It pointed them toward faith, yet not everyone reacted this way. John records that some individuals left Bethany and went directly to the Pharisees to report what had happened. Their actions are fascinating, because they demonstrate that witnessing a miracle does not automatically determine how a person interprets it. These individuals were not denying that something extraordinary had occurred. In fact, they carried news of the miracle to Jerusalem. The issue was not whether the event happened. The issue was what the event meant. To understand their response. It is important to remember the political and religious environment of first-century Judea. Jerusalem was already filled with debate about Jesus. Some believed he was a prophet. Others wondered whether he might be the Messiah. Still others regarded him as dangerous. Every new miracle intensified these discussions. The raising of Lazarus did not occur in an isolated village far from public attention. It happened only a short distance from Jerusalem itself. News would spread quickly. Pilgrims traveling through the region would hear about it. Religious leaders would hear about it. ordinary citizens would hear about it. The implications extended far beyond the happiness of one restored family. This was now a public event, with potentially enormous consequences. The individuals who reported the miracle to the Pharisees may have acted for various reasons. Some may have felt obligated to inform religious authorities about anything connected to Jesus. Others may have been skeptical of him despite what they witnessed. Still others may have feared the social and political consequences of his growing influence. Whatever their motives, their report ensured that the miracle would soon become the focus of official attention. At this point, the narrative begins shifting from personal restoration to public controversy. Up to now, the story has centered on Lazarus, Martha, Mary, and the grief of a single family. From this moment forward, the consequences expand outward. The miracle becomes a matter of national concern. This transition is one of the most important developments in the entire Gospel of John. The raising of Lazarus is not merely the climax of one story, it becomes the catalyst for another. Historians often observe that major turning points rarely occur because of a single event alone. Instead, one event serves as the spark that ignites tensions already present beneath the surface. The miracle at Bethany functions in exactly this way. Opposition to Jesus did not begin here. Religious leaders had already challenged him repeatedly. Conflicts over authority, interpretation of Scripture, and messianic claims had been escalating for months. Yet the resurrection of Lazarus dramatically changed the scale of the problem. Healing a blind man was remarkable. Feeding a multitude was impressive. Raising a man who had been dead for 4 days was something else entirely. The event could not easily be ignored or dismissed. Too many people had witnessed it. Too many people knew Lazarus personally. Too many people could verify what had happened. As a result, the miracle created a crisis for those who opposed Jesus. The very evidence that led some people to faith intensified the concerns of others. This paradox lies at the heart of chapter 10. The same sign produced radically different reactions. For believers, Lazarus's resurrection confirmed hope. For opponents, it increased alarm. For Martha and Mary, it brought unimaginable joy. For certain leaders in Jerusalem, it represented a growing threat. John intentionally highlights this contrast because it reveals a deeper truth about human response to revelation. Evidence alone does not guarantee belief. People interpret evidence through existing assumptions, loyalties, fears, and expectations. The crowd gathered at Bethany was not divided because some saw the miracle and others missed it. They were divided because they drew different conclusions from the same event. As news continued spreading beyond the village, excitement and anxiety grew simultaneously. Those who believed in Jesus found their confidence strengthened. Those who opposed him became increasingly concerned. Meanwhile, Lazarus himself stood as living proof that something extraordinary had occurred. His very existence now posed a challenge to anyone attempting to dismiss the event. Every conversation about Jesus would eventually lead back to the same question: what do we do with Lazarus? He was dead. Now he is alive. The answer to that question would soon force the religious leadership into a decision that would alter the course of history. Unknowingly, the crowd leaving Bethany carried more than news of a miracle. They carried the report that would set in motion the final confrontation between Jesus and the authorities in Jerusalem. The man who had just been restored to life had become the center of a controversy far larger than himself, and the consequences were only beginning. The raising of Lazarus was the greatest public miracle recorded in the Gospel of John, but it also produced an outcome that few people in Bethany could have anticipated. Lazarus received life. Yet the miracle that restored him would soon place Jesus on a direct path toward death. This irony lies at the center of the chapter, and marks one of the most important turning points in the entire New Testament narrative. Up until now, Opposition to Jesus had been growing steadily, but after Bethany, that opposition hardened into a deliberate plan. The sign that convinced many ordinary people to believe became the very reason influential leaders concluded that Jesus had to be eliminated. News of the miracle spread rapidly from Bethany to Jerusalem. Given the close proximity between the two locations, this development was inevitable. Pilgrims, mourners, travelers, and residents all carried reports of what had happened. The story was impossible to ignore. A man known to many people had died, been buried, and then returned alive. Whether one believed Jesus was the Messiah or not, the event demanded a response. The religious leadership could no longer treat him as merely another controversial teacher wandering through Galilee and Judea. His influence was becoming too significant. His popularity was expanding. Most importantly, the evidence supporting his claims was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The Gospel of John describes how the chief priests and Pharisees responded by calling a meeting of the Sanhedrin. This was not an ordinary gathering. The Sanhedrin functioned as the highest Jewish governing council, composed of leading priests, elders, and religious authorities. While Roman officials retained ultimate political control, the Sanhedrin exercised considerable influence over religious and social affairs within Jewish society. The decision to convene such a council demonstrates the seriousness of the situation. The miracle at Bethany had become more than a theological debate. It was now perceived as a matter with national implications. During the meeting, the leaders voiced a concern that reveals much about their perspective. They acknowledged that Jesus was performing many signs. Significantly, the Gospel does not portray them as denying that extraordinary events were occurring. Instead, their concern centered on the consequences. If Jesus continued attracting followers, they feared that growing public enthusiasm could create instability. In their view, such instability might provoke intervention from Rome. The Roman Empire tolerated local religious practices as long as order was maintained. Any movement capable of generating unrest, especially one connected to messianic expectations, carried political risks. The leaders worried that Rome could respond harshly, threatening both the nation and their own positions of authority. From a historical perspective, these fears were not entirely irrational. Judea, during the 1st century, was a volatile region. Nationalistic movements occasionally emerged. Messianic claimants sometimes attracted followers. Roman authorities were quick to suppress anything resembling rebellion. The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which occurred only a few decades later, would demonstrate just how devastating Roman intervention could be. Yet, while the leaders' concerns contained elements of practical reasoning, the Gospel also suggests a deeper problem. Their focus had shifted from evaluating the truth of Jesus' claims to calculating the political cost of his influence. The miracle itself became secondary. The question was no longer whether Lazarus had been raised. The question was, what should be done about the growing movement surrounding Jesus? It is within this context that Caiaphas, the high priest that year, delivered one of the most remarkable statements in the Gospel. He argued that it would be better for one man to die for the people than for the entire nation to suffer. On the surface, his words express political pragmatism. Sacrifice one individual in order to preserve stability. Remove Jesus before his popularity creates larger problems. Yet, John presents the statement with profound irony. According to the Gospel, Caiaphas unknowingly spoke more truth than he realized. While he intended the words as justification for eliminating Jesus, they also foreshadowed the Christian understanding of Jesus' death as an act performed on behalf of others. This dual meaning transforms the scene into one of the most striking examples of irony in biblical literature. A leader seeking to stop Jesus inadvertently articulates a central aspect of the gospel message. From that day forward, the narrative says, the leaders began actively plotting to put Jesus to death. This statement represents a decisive shift. Opposition had existed before. Hostility had existed before. Attempts to discredit him had existed before. But now, a formal decision had been reached. The raising of Lazarus became the catalyst that moved the conflict into its final phase. The miracle had achieved exactly what Jesus intended. It revealed the glory of God. It strengthened the faith of many. It demonstrated his authority over death. Yet it also forced his opponents into a choice. Rather than embracing the implications of the sign, they chose resistance. This development reveals one of the deepest themes running through John's Gospel. Every revelation demands a response. People cannot remain neutral indefinitely. The same evidence that draws some individuals toward belief pushes others toward rejection. The events following Lazarus' resurrection illustrate this principle with extraordinary clarity. Martha and Mary saw hope fulfilled. Many witnesses saw proof of divine power. The disciples saw confirmation of Jesus' identity. The religious authorities saw a growing threat. The sign was the same. The interpretations were radically different. Meanwhile, Jesus responded by withdrawing temporarily from public activity near Jerusalem. Knowing that the danger had intensified, he traveled to a region near the wilderness with his disciples. Yet this withdrawal did not represent retreat. The momentum of the narrative was already carrying him toward its inevitable destination. The decision had been made. The conflict was now irreversible. Every road led toward Jerusalem. Every development pointed toward Passover. Every event moved closer to the cross. Looking back, it is difficult to overstate the importance of what happened after Lazarus emerged from the tomb. Without the miracle, opposition to Jesus might have continued gradually. With the miracle, everything accelerated. The man who walked out of the grave became living evidence that forced a decision upon everyone who encountered the story. For some, that evidence inspired faith. For others, it inspired fear. For the leaders gathered in the Sanhedrin, it inspired a deadly plan. Thus, the greatest miracle before the resurrection of Jesus became the event that set his own death firmly in motion. Lazarus had been given life, but in the eyes of those determined to preserve their power, the price of that miracle would be the life of the one who called him out of the tomb. The story of Lazarus could have ended the moment he stepped out of the tomb. From a narrative perspective, the miracle had already reached its climax. A man who had been dead for 4 days was alive again. A grieving family had been restored. The authority of Jesus over death had been publicly demonstrated before numerous witnesses. Yet the Gospel of John does not end the account there. Instead, it provides one final chapter that reveals something both fascinating and deeply significant. Lazarus did not disappear after the miracle. He continued living. He continued interacting with people, and in doing so, he became something no argument could easily refute. He became a living witness. When John chapter 12 opens, the scene returns once again to Bethany. 6 days before Passover, Jesus arrives in the village where Lazarus lived. The timing is important because the narrative is now moving rapidly toward the final week before the crucifixion. Jerusalem is filling with pilgrims preparing for the feast. Expectations are rising. Tensions are increasing. The decision to kill Jesus has already been made by influential leaders. Against this backdrop, a dinner is held in his honor. The setting feels almost peaceful compared to the conflicts unfolding elsewhere. Martha serves the meal, consistent with the role she has occupied throughout the narrative. Lazarus sits at the table with Jesus. The image is simple, yet its significance is extraordinary. Only a short time earlier, Lazarus had been inside a tomb. Now he is sharing a meal. The contrast would have been impossible for anyone present to ignore. The scene becomes even more memorable when Mary takes an expensive perfume, pours it on Jesus' feet, and wipes them with her hair. The act expresses profound devotion and foreshadows the events surrounding Jesus' approaching death. Yet, while much attention is often given to Mary's action, John includes another detail that directly relates to Lazarus. Large crowds begin arriving in Bethany, not only because Jesus is there, but because they want to see Lazarus as well. This detail reveals something important about the aftermath of the miracle. Lazarus himself had become a public attraction. People traveled specifically to look at the man who had been raised from the dead. From a historical standpoint, this reaction is entirely understandable. Imagine hearing reports that someone widely known to have died was now alive again. Curiosity alone would draw crowds. Skeptics would want to investigate. Believers would want confirmation. Others would simply want to see for themselves whether the stories were true. Lazarus had become living evidence that something extraordinary had occurred. Every conversation with him, every public appearance, and every meal shared in his presence reinforced the reality of the event at Bethany. This created a problem for the authorities. Earlier, they had determined that Jesus represented a threat. Now, another challenge stood before them. Lazarus embodied the miracle they wished would disappear. According to John's account, many people were believing in Jesus because of Lazarus. Notice the significance of this statement. Lazarus was not preaching sermons. He was not leading a movement. He was not engaging in public debates. His mere existence was influencing people. Every time someone saw him alive, they were confronted with the question that had troubled Jerusalem ever since the miracle occurred. How did this happen? The authorities understood that Lazarus himself had become evidence. As a result, the chief priests made an astonishing decision. They began discussing plans to kill Lazarus as well. This detail is one of the most remarkable and revealing elements in the entire narrative. It demonstrates how far the opposition had progressed. Earlier, the focus had been solely on Jesus. Now, the hostility extended to the man he had raised. Ironically, Lazarus was being targeted not because of anything he had done, but because of what had happened to him. He had become inconvenient evidence. The logic of the situation is striking. If Jesus' opponents could not easily deny the miracle, removing Lazarus might reduce its impact. Whether such a plan could ever have succeeded is another question entirely. Yet, the fact that it was considered reveals the desperation of those attempting to stop the growing influence of Jesus. At this point, Lazarus occupies a unique place in the gospel narrative. He serves as a living symbol of everything Jesus claimed about himself. Earlier, Jesus had declared, "I am the resurrection and the life." Lazarus stood as visible testimony to that claim. His presence transformed abstract theology into observable reality. Anyone who saw him could not escape the connection between the man and the miracle. Yet, the story also contains a subtle reminder that Lazarus's resurrection was not identical to the resurrection Christians would later associate with Jesus. Lazarus had been restored to ordinary earthly life. He returned to his family. He resumed daily activities. He ate, walked, and lived among his community. But one day, Lazarus would die again. The gospel never suggests otherwise. His resurrection was extraordinary, but it was temporary. In contrast, the resurrection of Jesus would be presented as something fundamentally different, a victory over death that would never be reversed. This distinction is crucial because it helps explain the role Lazarus plays within John's narrative. He is not the final destination of the story. He is a sign pointing beyond himself. His restoration anticipates a greater event still to come. What happened in Bethany foreshadows what will happen in Jerusalem. The man raised from the tomb becomes a preview of a much larger revelation. This brings us to the deeper meaning of Lazarus' story. Throughout the narrative, readers encounter themes that extend far beyond a single miracle. They encounter grief, uncertainty, delayed answers, faith under pressure, and the mystery of divine timing. Martha and Mary learned that love does not always prevent suffering. The disciples learned that apparent delays can serve a larger purpose. The crowd learned that evidence alone does not guarantee belief. The religious leaders revealed how fear and self-preservation can distort judgment. And Lazarus himself became a living testimony that death does not possess ultimate authority when confronted by the one who called himself the resurrection and the life. In the end, the complete story of Lazarus is not primarily about Lazarus. He remains central to the narrative, but he is not its final focus. The story ultimately directs attention toward Jesus. Every stage of the account points back to his identity. The delay reveals his purpose. The conversation with Martha reveals his claims. The tears reveal his compassion. The miracle reveals his power. The reaction of the crowds reveals the challenge of belief. And the plot against him reveals the cost of his mission. Lazarus walked out of his tomb because Jesus called him, yet only a short time later, Jesus himself would walk toward a cross. The man who received life at Bethany would continue living because another man was about to surrender his own. That is why the story of Lazarus occupies such a pivotal place in the Gospel of John. It is not merely the account of a dead man returning to life. It is the final sign pointing toward the greater story that was about to unfold. The tomb of Lazarus was opened so that the world might better understand who Jesus truly was. And in that sense, the story never really ends. It continues to ask every generation the same question that echoed through Bethany nearly 2,000 years ago. What do you believe about the one who called a dead man out of his grave? When most people remember the story of Lazarus, they remember a single moment. A man walks out of a tomb after being dead for 4 days. It is one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire Bible, and one of the most recognizable miracles associated with Jesus. Yet, after examining the complete story, it becomes clear that the raising of Lazarus is about far more than a miraculous return to life. In reality, every chapter of the narrative points toward deeper questions about faith, suffering, identity, hope, and the nature of God's purposes. The story begins not with power, but with pain. It begins with illness, uncertainty, and a family facing a crisis they cannot control. Martha and Mary believed Jesus could help. They trusted him. They loved him. Yet, despite that relationship, they still experienced loss. This reality challenges a common assumption that faith automatically prevents suffering. The Gospel presents a different picture. The family most closely associated with Jesus in Bethany was not spared from grief. Instead, they were forced to walk through it. Their experience reminds readers that the presence of faith does not eliminate hardship. Sometimes faith is tested precisely in the midst of hardship. One of the most profound lessons emerges from the delay itself. Throughout the story, Jesus never loses control of the situation. Yet, from the perspective of those waiting in Bethany, his actions seem confusing. He receives the message, but does not immediately come. He knows the danger, but waits. He understands the outcome, but remains silent. For Martha and Mary, the delay felt like absence. For the reader, however, the delay ultimately reveals purpose. This tension has resonated with generations because it reflects a universal human experience. People often judge circumstances according to what they can currently see, while remaining unaware of a larger picture beyond their understanding. The Lazarus narrative does not offer simple answers to every question about suffering. What it does suggest is that divine silence and divine absence are not necessarily the same thing. The story also presents one of the clearest revelations of Jesus' identity in the Gospel of John. Before Lazarus ever leaves the tomb, Jesus declares, "I am the resurrection and the life." This statement stands at the theological center of the narrative. Notice that Jesus does not merely claim to perform resurrection, he claims to embody it. The distinction is crucial. Throughout the Gospel, signs and miracles point beyond themselves toward his identity. The raising of Lazarus is no exception. The miracle matters because of what it reveals about the one performing it. John wants readers to understand that the authority displayed at the tomb is connected directly to who Jesus is. This explains why the story repeatedly shifts attention away from Lazarus and back toward Jesus. Lazarus is important, but he is not the ultimate focus. He is the sign. Jesus is the revelation. Another important distinction emerges when comparing Lazarus' resurrection with the resurrection of Jesus. Lazarus was restored to ordinary earthly life. He returned to his family, his community, and his daily existence. Yet nothing in Scripture suggests that he became immortal. One day, he would face death again. The resurrection of Jesus, by contrast, is presented as a permanent victory over death itself. Lazarus serves as a preview. Jesus becomes the fulfillment. This distinction helps explain why the story occupies such a strategic position within John's Gospel. The resurrection of Lazarus points forward to an even greater event still to come. In many ways, Bethany becomes the final sign before Jerusalem. The miracle prepares readers for the central claim of Christianity by demonstrating that death is not beyond the authority of Christ. The reactions surrounding the miracle also reveal something important about human nature. Not everyone responded the same way. Some witnesses believed, others remained skeptical. Some saw evidence of divine power. Others saw a threat to their authority and security. This division continued even after Lazarus emerged from the tomb. The same event produced opposite conclusions. The Gospel repeatedly emphasizes this pattern because it reflects a deeper truth. Evidence alone does not determine belief. People interpret evidence through existing assumptions, fears, loyalties, and desires. The story, therefore, becomes not only a revelation of Jesus, but also a mirror reflecting the hearts of those who encounter him. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful aspect of the narrative remains the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Before demonstrating his power over death, he entered into the grief of those who mourned. Before commanding Lazarus to come out, he stood beside a broken family. This detail prevents the story from becoming merely a display of supernatural authority. It reminds readers that compassion and power exist together in the character of Jesus. The one who calls the dead to life is also the one who shares in human sorrow. His tears reveal that divine strength is not indifferent to suffering. Instead, it meets suffering face to face. Ultimately, the story of Lazarus forces readers to confront the same question that echoed through Bethany nearly 2,000 years ago. Who is Jesus? Is he merely a teacher, a prophet, a miracle worker, or is he truly what he claimed to be, the resurrection and the life? Every element of the narrative points toward that question. The illness, the delay, the grief, the tears, the tomb, the miracle, the divided crowd, and even the plot that leads toward the cross all converge upon it. Lazarus walked out of his grave because Jesus called him by name. According to the Gospel of John, that moment was not simply a demonstration of power. It was a revelation of identity. The man standing outside the tomb was claiming authority over the very thing humanity fears most. Whether viewed through the lens of faith, history, theology, or literature, The story of Lazarus remains one of the most compelling narratives ever recorded. It begins with death, but it refuses to end there. It begins with grief, but it points beyond grief. And at its center stands a declaration that continues to challenge, inspire, and provoke reflection across centuries. I am the resurrection and the life. Everything in the story ultimately leads back to those words, and everything that follows in the gospel will flow from them.